All right. So good afternoon. My name is Iris Straszewski. I've been here at the NFREC Quincy since 2015 when I started my master's under Dr. Joe Funderburk, and I am now a PhD student in entomology under Dr. Xavier Martini here. So welcome and thank you for joining us. I would like to say a special welcome to any of our past NFREC faculty, staff, and all of our stakeholders who have joined us here today. I'm going to share the screen. As we kick off the Centennial celebration for our center, we wanted to specifically focus on the accomplishments and impacts of the NFREC over the last 100 years. This is the first of 3 seminars we will hold entitled Reflections and Perspectives, 100 Years of the NFREC Quincy. I hope you will also join us on September 9th as we share our current priority areas and challenges as they relate to agriculture and natural resources, and again on September 29th to learn about how we aim to adapt our programs and to address emerging issues in the NFREC mission as we move forward. Today, our seminar will be a journey through the past, and we'll begin with our speakers, Dr. Ann Blount, Dr. Richard Sprenkel, and Dr. Pete Andersen. They will take us down memory lane and share with us images and stories from the past decades, including impacts we have had on the community and the evolution of the facility and programs over the years. Following, we will have an open Q&A panel. Please put any questions you have throughout their presentations in the chat, and we will address them during the Q&A at the end. Before we get started, I would like to quickly introduce our speakers today. Dr. Richard Sprenkel is a professor emeritus of entomology and served as the interim director of the NFREC from 2007 to 2008. Dr. Sprenkel has been instrumental in pest management in a variety of crops, and he's made huge strides in the sustainable management of thrips and tomato spotted wilt virus. Dr. Pete Andersen is Professor Emeritus of Horticulture. He began work at the NFREC in 1984 and retired in 2019. Much of his research focused on culture and management of fruit and nut crops, genetic improvement, and cultivar evaluation of fruit and nut crops, as well as the effects of plant physiology and biochemistry on insect and plant pathogens. Finally, Dr. Ann Blount is a professor in forage breeding and genetics. Dr. Blount has been at the NFREC for over 3 decades, during which her research and breeding efforts focused on physiological aspects of fall season forage production and complementary disease, insect, and nematode resistances to allow the forages to be productive outside normal growing seasons. The major forage crop effort in the program is breeding improvement in Bahia grass and evaluation of new introductions of perennial peanut. Thank you for being here and taking time to share with us your stories, and I will now hand it over to Dr. Blount.
I'm going to start out talking a little bit of an overview of the history of the North Florida Research and Education Center. We weren't always as diversified as we are now. In the past, we started out as a tobacco research center, and from there we blossomed to identify problems in the North Florida area in agriculture and identify solutions for those problems and hire faculty along the way that can take on such tasks. So we're going to start with a little bit of background history, and I'll be fairly brief and I'll let you follow along. But we did start out in the 1920s as a tobacco experiment station, and we weren't located where we are now. We were located off a High Bridge Road, and we changed our location twice until we reached our final location on Pat Thomas Highway. Back in the day, tobacco research was also multidisciplinary. We had a number of faculty that were involved in agronomy, soils, entomology, plant pathology, and horticulture, even back that early. In 1933, cattle were added to the research station, and then by the late 30s, we had started to expand our horizons, looking at many more farm crops that were representative for this location of Florida. Sugarcane was very important, especially syrup type sugarcane. We actually released a sugarcane variety in 1938. And then in the 1940s, we expanded our land mass at the research station where we are located now. And we included more field crop and livestock and extension programs. And then a very large cattle program that began in 1946. And then we continued on into the 50s, developing rust-resistant ryegrass. There was a lot of lupin and soybean evaluations that took place. The station still had a focus on shade tobacco, releasing Dixie Shade. It was a black shank resistant variety around the early 1950s. In 1957, we actually had a horticultural program. We were doing vegetable trials and working with small deciduous fruits. Tomatoes came into play, and we developed a soil testing laboratory established right here at this location. By 1963, we were very heavily multidisciplinary. We worked a lot on shade tobacco continually, but animal husbandry, horticulture, field crops, and forages were certainly up and coming programs. Floor Runner and Sun Lake peanuts were released in 1970 from Gainesville and Mariana, but a lot of the variety testing for that was done here at this research station. And small grains breeding, which had pretty much focused on oat variety development, expanded to include wheat and triticale. The Agricultural Research and Education Center had a very strong program in integrated pest management. And that started around the late 1970s, 1979, when Dr. Sprenkel, who will be a presenter today, came to the station as a faculty. And then during the 1980s, we moved into a big push in conservation tillage. We had a outreach with precision agriculture, trying to prevent any further erosion in the Florida Panhandle and control some of the fertilizer applications with the precision approach. Then during the 1990s, the center was renamed from the Agricultural Research and Education Center as the North Florida Research and Education Center. Then following that, in the 1990s, the peanut program that was located at Mariana also did a lot of work at Quincy, and we had a tremendous effort in working with tomato spotted wilt virus resistance. And then at that time, the horticultural program that was located once in Monticello relocated to Quincy, and Dr. Pete Andersen will discuss that in a little bit. So from 2000 to 2009, the emphasis changed slightly. We had a lot of work done on Asian soybean rust, fusarium resistance with hardlock and cotton. That was a major player in that period of time. Sod-based rotation became very popular, where we integrated row cropping and pasture, and then eventually included livestock. And then the citrus nursery was established at the research station, and the forage program was expanded at the Quincy location. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Richard Sprenkel, and he's going to tell you a little bit about the entomology efforts here at the research station.
Good afternoon. I'm going to take a slightly different tact. I'm going to talk, the name is the North Florida Research and Education Center. I'm going to put more emphasis on the education, or today I'm just going to substitute Extension Center because this was my primary responsibility while I was here. And I think you'll see some of the programs that that have come out of the North Florida Research and Education, or Extension Center, and why it's equally as important as the research done here. In Nick Comerford's draft, before he left, he started drafting a history of the North Florida Research and Education Center, and he lists two entomologists from 1970 that were on the faculty, Bill Tappan, who I'll discuss in a minute, and G.L. Green. Gerald Green was spent some time at the Sanford experiment station before coming to Quincy, and he was only here for a fairly short period of time, but he was conducting research in row and vegetable crops. Maybe some of you remember Dr. Green, but I met him at some scientific meetings. and he left before I got here. But he left here, went back to Kansas, become director of the Kansas State University Garden City Experiment Station. For those of you who know him, he recently passed away in this past May, 2021. So he was a fine gentleman and really missed him. When I joined the center in 1979, there were two entomologists here, Bill Chapman, who I mentioned before, who worked primarily on sun tobacco at the research unit in Suwannee County. This was because shade tobacco, having left the North Florida Research and Education Center here at Quincy, and he followed the tobacco trail and went to shade tobacco rather than the staying with sun tobacco here in Gadsden County, which was no longer grown. At Quincy, Mr. Chapman also published papers on peanut insect control and mite control on redworm beds. So I guess in the extended way of thinking, he did do some work on livestock insects with the redworm beds. The second entomologist at Quincy was Don Herzog, who conducted research on soybean insect pests. Both Bill and Don had 100% or nearly 100% research appointments. And so there was some extension support through field days and answering growers' questions as needed and that sort of thing, but no real strong extension thrust at that point. Don Herzog had been part of the Huffaker project. Some of you are familiar with this, but Carl Huffaker was at the University of California and decided to pull together a number of entomologists and working on a project that started in 1971. This was funded by the National Science Foundation, EPA, and USDA, truly some heavy hitters in the funding agency. But this project included seven cropping systems and funded more than 300 scientists at 19 different land-grant universities. So it was pretty much all encompassing. University of Florida was involved in two of the cropping systems, citrus at Lake Alfred and soybeans at the North Florida Research and Education Center, or Extension Center as I've been calling it. In soybeans from that early start, 1971, till the late 1970s, studies from the 7 universities involved in soybeans generated, as you can imagine, a tremendous amount of information on the impact of soybean insect pests, the dynamic economic thresholds, sampling techniques, impact and conservation of beneficial organisms, control techniques, and so on. And so at the end of this period, there was a tremendous amount of data sitting there. And much of this data on the soybean stink bug complex and the velvet bean caterpillar came from the North Florida Research and Education Center. So this was the sort of the research tie-in there for this large project. Toward the end of the Huffaker project, the funding shifted from research to an implementation of the management programs, utilizing all this data that was just sitting there in journals and bulletins and what have you. And then this is where I entered the picture, with my position being supported by soft money from the implementation funding, using information generated by the Huffaker project at Quincy and elsewhere, training materials for insect pests from soybeans, cotton, peanuts, and corn to be developed and provided to Florida farmers. And so this is how that all tied in, as Ann mentioned earlier, how that all tied into being an integrated pest management center for North Florida, with just starting off with generating the data here and then following up with transmitting that data or implementing that data in the field. As an aside, I think this is one of the unique aspects of extension programs. For example, we in Florida would not be justified in developing a Mexican bean beetle program on soybeans, or management of Mexican bean beetle on soybeans, because it's only an occasional pest here. And I think if any researcher got involved with that, they'd be largely coming up empty year after year, but occasionally they would have a productive year. When I was in North Carolina, this was one of the major pests up there. We generated quite a bit of information on the Mexican bean beetle. But for the Florida farmer, we can use those data from elsewhere, and as far as the damage thresholds and nature of the damage and what to expect of the pest, and still come out with a fairly good extension program, even though the data were not generated here. The other crop I would like to discuss is cotton, and specifically the boll weevil. When I came to Florida in 1979, there were about 5,000 acres of cotton in the state, most of it concentrated in the far western panhandle. The acreage was expanding prior to that and continued to expand after I got here, further east in the panhandle. And we found out that once cotton was in an area for 2 years or 3 years, boll weevil became a key pest, triggering lots of insecticide applications during the season, and that released a lot of the secondary pests to build and cause damage. So this was becoming a real problem. For a number of years, the Agricultural Research Services and land-grant universities in Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana had been studying the problem and identified what appeared to be a major weakness of the boll weevil. By targeting this weakness over a wide area, it was felt that the boll weevil could be eradicated from most, if not all, of the United States. And this is after the boll weevil crossed the Rio Grande River in the late 1800s, and by 1920 it was in North Carolina. So it had spread rapidly, quickly, and covered basically the whole coal cotton belt. The pilot program was begun on the Virginia-North Carolina state line in 1978, the year before I got here. After 2 seasons, it was evident the program was working, and it was expanded southward. After a 2 to 3 period of operating the program in a particular area, it was expanded to the next stage using natural breaks in the cotton production areas. And then until 1987, it would eventually got to Florida, and Florida was included in the program. Now, this is where extension comes into play, and particularly extension of the North Florida Research and Education Center. This program had a number of players. First of all, Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services Division of Plant Industry conducted a referendum among cotton growers to approve the program and to assess themselves a per acre fee to pay for the program. Florida Department of Agriculture also collected funds and transmitted those funds to the USDA to carry out some of the operations. Second player was USDA personnel who were charged with making day-to-day decisions, such as chemical applications and scheduling or arranging trap density, deciding trap density. Third player was private contractors who were responsible for setting up and monitoring the boll weevil traps, and also for making chemical applications by air or ground as necessary. The fourth player was the cotton farmers themselves. They were responsible for managing the crop and insect pests other than the boll weevil. So you had all these players involved there, plus there was one more, and that was the extension support from NFREC. Without that extension support to allow communication between these various agencies and the growers, growers were many times in the dark as far as what was going on or what to be expected, and generally how the program was progressing. In addition, in the early part of the eradication program, because of the heavy insecticide application use, beet armyworm trapping program was started, because this was one of the insect pests that, because of the heavy insecticide applications, was released from its natural enemies and caused tremendous amount of problems. And it was the beet armyworm that was the most frequently caused side effect of the boll eradication program. I retired from the North Florida Research and Education Center in 2008. At that time, there were 2 other entomology faculty, which you'll recall is the same number as when I arrived in 1979, but different individuals. In 2008, the two other entomologists were Russ Mizell and Joe Funderburg. Russ was conducting research on arthropod pests of deciduous fruits, pecans, woody landscape plants, citrus, and Joe's research centered on thrips, pests of fruiting vegetables. Since 2008, both Russ and Joe have retired. Currently, Xavier Martini is conducting research and extension programs on horticultural and citrus pests. So that sort of is a quick encapsulation of the entomological work here with some highlights of the extension programs. I want to, in summary and to conclude, I want to read you one paragraph from a newspaper article in the Gadsden County Times. This is from December the 15th, 1921. The title of the article is "Land for Tobacco Experimentation Has Been Purchased." End quote in the article. It is expected that this will only be a beginning in agricultural experiment work in Gadsden County, and that eventually the scope of that station will be extended to many other plants, will greatly increase appropriations to carry on the work on the extensive and to carry on the work on an extensive scale. By virtue of its splendid soil and other natural advantages, it is believed that this is an ideal county in which to experiment with plant life. Quite a visionary for 100 years ago, and the only correction or suggestion I have for change is to include the role extension is now playing in the North Florida Research and Education Center. I think I'll now turn it over to Pete.
So what am I going to use to advance?
The arrow key.
Okay. Hit it and see what happens here.
Yeah.
No? There you go. Okay. My name is Pete Andersen. I'll be talking a little bit about the history of Monticello. We have a rich history dating back to about 1929, and I will follow that through until we merged with the NFREC Quincy in about year 2000. And I will conclude with a few highlights for future emphasis. So let's see if it works here. No, it doesn't work here. So I'll put this one here.
This one.
There it is. The AREC Monticello is in the northern part of the state. Its charge basically was fruit production, nut production, and woody ornamentals. It's located roughly 20 miles east of Tallahassee, and this slide shows color-coded indication of chill hours received on an average year. And you can see up by Tallahassee and just east of Tallahassee, we receive on average about 500 plus hours of chilling every year. That enables us to grow subtropical and, if you will, subtemperate crops. But we do have limitations, and it's not, although we can grow lots of different crops, we do have serious limitations that precludes the diversity that we'd like to see up here. Some significant dates, the ARC Monticello. The center was first established in 1927 and 1929 on a 4-acre parcel. Fred Walker and Ari Nolan were the superintendents. The impetus for the establishment of the Pecan Laboratory were insect and disease pests that were taking hold in the pecan producing area of North Florida and South Georgia. Around the turn of the century, we had a lot of pecan plantations located in that region of the state and in Georgia. And the pecan scab was become an increasingly important problem. In 1941 through 1963, the laboratory was under the UF Plant Path Department and Entomological Science Departments. And finally, in 1963, we had a new facility constructed and was named the Big Ben Horticultural Laboratory. And at this point in time, it was expanded, the mission was expanded to include fruit crops in general and nut crops and woody ornamentals. And Harold Young was the director. A few other significant dates for the ARC Monticello was in 1964 through 1966. We had some money and a research building constructed by the USDA to study tongue production in North Florida. Tongue was a growing industry at the time, and it appeared to have quite a bit of potential. And ironically, today, there is some renewed interest in tongue production, and Patrick Minogue is heading that program. In 1973 through 1983, Calvin Arnold was named director, the first director, and I have a press release here where he was recognized as the youngest administrator in Florida at the age of 29. In 1982 through 1994, Don Herzog was director, the named director, and we merged with the NFREC Quincy. It became officially part of the NFREC system. And then 1999 through 2001, the Monticello faculty moved to the Quincy location. This is a picture of Calvin Arnold, more recently taken. He's doing well, as far as I know. He's doing quite well. Russ Mizell, very productive in his younger days, and he still has been productive in his older days too. But a very productive scientist working in on woody ornamentals and fruit and nut crops. That's myself at a younger age. I don't know exactly how old, looks to be early 30s. Brent Broadbeck, my trusty biological scientist. Gary Knox, who's still working with us at Quincy, and he's the only current member of the Monticello faculty that is still employed at the Quincy Center. Jeff Norsini and Ralph Jackson. Ralph Jackson, when I came to the Monticello Center, I was pretty impressed by how things were kept. The plantings were very well manicured. We had a crew of only 4 people, yet the amount of work and the physical plant, and as well as the horticultural plantings, were very, very well maintained by Ralph Jackson. In fact, when the deans would visit us on a monthly basis or bi-monthly basis, they would comment on how good the center looked and how it was probably the prettiest center in IFAS. It was like a park, like an arboretum. And I'll show some slides of some of the crops that we had grown there. this is one of our get-togethers. I think actually it was a farewell, so to speak, party of the Monticello faculty and staff. You'll see Ronnie Barnwell on the far left with his arms folded. He was he, along with Richard Brumley, who was in the back right corner, were responsible for most of the work that got done in the field. Lamar Quinn is the one that's looking for food or utensils to the right of Richard. And he was a mechanic as well as he assisted in the field. So we had a very close-knit faculty and staff. It was very much a family atmosphere. It was difficult for me to put all the accomplishments together, so I just listed a few. One of the things we were charged with was releasing new varieties of peaches, nectarines, plums, and grapes for North Florida. And we, as I'll show you in a minute, we did quite a bit of that. Sustainability assessments has been an emphasis for a long time. As I indicated before, although we can grow lots of different crops up in North Florida, the high humidity and high rainfall during the summer makes it extremely difficult. A specific discovery that is worth touting was one by Bill French, that when he discovered that thorny peach disease and other xylem-limited diseases were not caused by a virus, but they were caused by a bacterium, which has been named Xylella fastidiosa. Russ and I were involved in publishing much of the literature on the influence of the xylem chemistry on leaf hopper vectors of these xylem-limited diseases. Gary Knox has been involved with evaluating cultivars of crepe myrtle and lots of other ornamentals as well. And Gary is also a leader for the Florida Friendly Landscape. Pecans at one point were profitable industry, but they've fallen on hard times lately between hurricanes and competition from Mexico, and also high disease and insect pressure for North Florida. The very popular variety is called Elliott, which is somewhat resistant to scab. And the pecan industry is currently about 12,000 acres statewide, but much of that is not well maintained. There's a shot of some white fleshed peaches. Some of the peaches that we've released from the NFREC include this list here: Florida King, Florida Globe, Florida Rio, and the nectarines Sun Dollar, Sun Gem, Sun Mist, Sun Coast. All the Florida released peaches begin with Florida, F-L-O-R-D-A, and all the nectarines begin with the prefix Sun, S-U-N. The Sun Coast, I believe I released that in 1996. Blueberries have been a very popular crop in North Florida and they've recently expanded greatly in the southern part of the state. We grow both rabbit-eye blueberries and in southern high-bush blueberries. Establishment costs are high, but it's a very sustainable crop. Muscadine grapes, which is held steady in acreage, probably just a little less than 1,000 acres statewide. Some people really like them and some people don't like them at all, and there's not very many in-betweens. Uyu is a type of oriental persimmon that is non-astringent, so you can pick it when it's still fairly firm and not have an unpleasant taste sensation. Here's Anna apple, Natchez blackberries, The Natchez blackberry and the other types of thornless blackberries are from Arkansas, and they're fairly sustainable, don't require a lot of pesticide sprays. I'll comment just a little bit about some future emphases that I think we're going to deal with, at least in the fruit and nut crop area. One is further investigating crops on the basis of agricultural sustainability. We can grow crops like blueberries and thornless blackberries and muscadine grapes, for example, without a lot of inputs. They're naturally resistant to most of the insect pests. Diseases can be kept under control in most cases. And for example, something like apple or plum or peaches, they're very labor intensive and very susceptible to insect diseases, and therefore there's lots of inputs involved. On the other hand, the rabbit-eye blueberries and the thornless blackberries and citrus to a large extent are fairly sustainable, and they can be grown without too much trouble. The other emphasis, I think, in the fruit and nut crop area in the future will be the cold hardy citrus. And the reason for the emphasis we place now on cold hardy citrus is because the last 2 decades have been warmer than average. You can see the temperature on the right-hand side, temperature degrees Fahrenheit, and over the last 17 years, our minimum temperature was 15 degrees. Well, you think 15 degrees is pretty cold, and it is, but the citrus can adapt to cold temperatures if it receives a lot of previous cold prior to the really cold temperatures. So even though it does get cold, sometimes 15 to 20 degrees in North Florida, if your trees are cold acclimated, they can survive that. The important thing is for fruit production is to get the fruit off before it gets to that minimum temperature. So about early 2000s, 2004, I think we had our first satsuma planting at the Quincy, about a 2-acre planting. And this is probably not as clear as it could be, but I wanted to show this just for an indication of what kind of yield we're getting on our satsumas. And if you look at, just for example, the one on the left, up, it says Brown Select Rubidoux rootstock. Total yield per tree is 580 pounds per tree. That was an average. So there's no question that we can produce a lot of satsumas. And they are, the trees themselves are hardy down to about 12 degrees Fahrenheit. What I've been trying to instill upon growers and prospective growers is the fact that we need to diversify. The satsumas, they ripen in November. They're very perishable because they're kind of puffy and soft. They can't be handled like a traditional Valencia or Hamlin orange, but they are cold tolerant. But in our other plantings of other types of citrus, we've noticed in the past that with proper cold protection, such as micro jet irrigation, micro sprinkler irrigation, and also with cold acclimation occurring before the really minimum temperatures hit, we can grow a lot more citrus than just satsumas. So diversification is the key. We have now growers putting in other types of citrus. One gentleman by the name of Andy Jackson in Perry has probably a dozen different types of citrus now, including sweet oranges. Just to mention a few, Sugar Bell is released from the University of Florida breeding program, Fred Gemitter. It is cold tolerant. It ripens in November, December, so it avoids, the fruit avoids most of the cold. It's, as the name implies, very, very sweet. It's fairly high in acid in some years. It makes a really good blend with other types of juice oranges. It's highly productive, and probably equally important to all those other things, it is resistant to citrus greening. Here's another photo of a sugar bell, but this was one of the releases by Fred Gemitter. Tango is a seedless variety of Murcott, and it generally has no or just a few seeds. It's productive. It's very, very sweet. It ripens around Christmas time. So this is one of the priorities, I think, going forward in the fruit and nut crop area. It's going to be looking at these new varieties as soon as we possibly can get them from the breeding program in Lake Alfred. You can see Marathon on the top. It's the newest one out. There's a lot of interest in that. But basically what we're looking at is citrus that begin to ripen in October and ripen on through the season and up until about January 1st. After January 1st, the risk is a little bit too high because of even though the trees can survive the 20s for sure, the fruit itself will only be good at temperatures 24 and above. If we have sustained temperatures less than that, the fruit will freeze. So that's the reason why we want to expand the season all the way up until about January 1st. And of the UF varieties we have listed there, UF Glow, UF Sunrise, and UF Dawn are from Jose Chaparro's breeding program. All the rest are from the Lake Alfred program, Fred Gemitter and Jude Grosser. I thought I'd mention a little bit about the forestry program. This is a photo of Pat Renaud. And the reason why I mentioned it is because of the significance on a statewide scale. This slide that Patrick shared with me, it's the largest industry in the state, contributes $25 billion to the state, provides 124,000 jobs statewide, and also the timber sales has helped the NFREC's system by generating a lot of money for various uses. Patrick's research extension emphasis is vegetation management and ecological restoration. So that's what I have about the NFREC, and we now transition to
Agronomy. So I'm going to finish up, and I want to thank Richard Sprenkel and Pete Andersen for giving us some background history and entomology and horticulture. I'm going to finish up talking a little bit about agronomy. So agronomy encompasses both soils and crop sciences, and I thought I'd give you a little timeline. So back in the 1920s, when we were focusing on shade tobacco, we had to focus seriously on fertility for that particular crop, and then new crops were moving into the area. So we always had a very strong soil science program here, starting with R.W. Rupert back in the early 20s. Then in the 1930s, we moved into sugarcane breeding. So for those of you who are familiar with the area, sugarcane and sugarcane syrup are very popular still in this region. And to this day, the NFREC still has sugarcane available on the station, a lot of variety testing. And we do a sharing of germplasm through an extension program with the local public. Dr. Tisdale worked on shade tobacco, releasing a number of varieties in the 1930s. Dewey Warner, who eventually became the center director here, started out in oat breeding. By the 1940s, we had Tom Webb on board in agronomy. He was doing ryegrass breeding, and I didn't even realize that, even though I had a history with ryegrass breeding, that Florida rust resistance was actually started with ecotypes selected here that had good rust resistance on this very, very popular cool season forage. About that same time in the 40s, Sloan Baker came on board. He was in animal science, and even though he's not an agronomist or soil scientist, he worked very closely with the developing forage breeding programs at the research station. So the beef cattle industry was increasing across the Florida Panhandle, very, very heavy production of cattle in the Gadsden County area. And then with it came the need for good forages, and Sloan Baker provided extension outreach in forage variety selection, as well as developing beef cattle genetics for the area. Back in the 1950s, tobacco breeding and a lot of varieties were released, and with that, we really we're known for the tobacco breeding. But at that point in time, we were also expanding into many other different cropping systems, as Pete mentioned in his talk. Bill Chapman, who eventually became the center director at the NFREC, actually released Florida rust-resistant variety of ryegrass, and that's probably the first ryegrass variety from IFAS that was so successful. And from that, today, we have a very, very large ryegrass breeding program and ryegrass varieties. So I'll talk about that in just a few minutes. By the 1960s, Fred Rhodes continued in the soils realm, focusing on soil fertility, fertilizer management, all these new crops that were coming on board. When I saw Fred in the 1970s, he was working on a large number of agronomic crops and looking at fertility management. Chapman was still here breeding oats and very active. And then eventually in the 1970s, Ron Barnett came on board, and he even named an oat variety after Dr. Chapman. So there is a Chapman oat that for a number of years was a popular variety. So during the 1970s, Ron Barnett came and kind of changed the focus of the oat breeding that was producing a lot of varieties at the time, but he changed the focus to soft red wheat. So that's what goes into crackers and cookie production. So if you like your Oreo cookie, probably the parentage is somewhere stemming from the small grains breeding program at NFREC. And Ron also worked on triticale, which is a unique cross between wheat and rye. It's a man-made cross and was very popular in the beginning as hog feed. Today, it's used mostly for high-end dairy and cattle grazing. David Wright joined us about that same time. And David Wright was more in the management end of agronomy. His focus was on conservation tillage, the importance of using precision agriculture, and of course, he's been the lead faculty working on sod-based rotation, now including not just crops and grass crops, row crops and grass crops, but also including livestock. In the 1980s, Bob Stanley expanded the forage management program and worked closely with the ryegrass breeder in Gainesville, Gordon Prine. And so when I came up in the late 70s and early 80s, there was a good bit of active variety development going on and testing in the forage realm. Ron Barnett was continuing his small grains breeding, and that expanded. There were soybean regional trials in the 1980s. When I came up in the late 80s, we were doing uniform group testing for the federal government on soybean varieties. David Wright was managing cotton variety testing. And then David at that point was also answering most of the forage variety questions and a lot of the forage management along with Bob Stanley. I joined the group in the 1980s, late 1980s. I worked for Dr. Barnett as his biosci for about 10 years until I left that program to create our forage breeding program and took the small grains in a slightly different direction, working with Dr. Barnett. And we started using small grains more for forages than for grain crop. I expanded our program. I worked with Gordon Prine on ryegrass development, and we had a relay breeding program between Gainesville, ONA, and the NFREC. Our program now expanded to work with Sunny Liao and Cheryl Makoviak, working with perennial peanut and some of the grasses and integrating legumes and grasses together. And then Jose Dubé joined us, and he's been very active he's located at Mariana, but getting very active in integration of legumes and grass pastures. In 2000s, we hired Cheryl Makoviak, so we have a relatively new soil scientist, and her focus has been nutrient management and particularly water quality, spends a lot of time working with the beef, cattle, and dairy industries. So I thought I would say a little bit from a plant breeding perspective, as Pete Andersen gave you some of the history on some of the horticultural crops released. From the NFREC, we've been involved in breeding all of these different types of crop species that are considered agronomic, and proofs in the pudding. Our clientele like to see our output. So what did we bring to the clientele? So I just wanted to give you a very quick overview. We had a huge impact on oat breeding in the southeastern United States starting in 1940, and you could just follow the years. So these are all releases that came from this location. And this is a little bit difficult to see, but the oat research continued all the way through Horizon 720 in 2014. Wheat and barley, there was an old history of barley variety development here at the research station. And then Ron Barnett's program, of course, included all the grain type wheats that went into the soft red wheat area for crackers and cookies, as I mentioned before. So eat your cookies. And this might be a good time. I'll just mention in 1980, when he released 301, it was a game changer. In 1984, the Florida 302 wheat was adapted across a lot of states across the southeastern United States. I came in 1988 to his program, and he was still very actively breeding wheat. I just want to make one comment here on a personal note. Jim Marwa and I were in a plant pathology class that toured all the research stations around the state. And we came to Quincy, and I remember making a comment to the class when we visited Dr. Barnett's program. I said, when I graduate, I want to live in a place just like Quincy, and I want to have a program just like Dr. Barnett's. Be very careful what you wish for. Okay, and then continuing with wheat, obviously Ron continued very heavily till he retired in 2005, but you can see a very active, very successful variety development program. Also very involved with cereal rye. Gator rye predated Dr. Barnett, but Gator rye was released in the 50s, and then again, a number of releases all the way up to present day with some new releases in cereal rye resulting from research done and plant breeding done at this station. Triticale, I mentioned, was a rye by wheat cross, not very well known, and now extremely growing in popularity all the way through to 2019 with our newest release of 08128. Ryegrass, we did the relay breeding with Gordon Prine from Gainesville, and I joined him as a graduate student back just about the time when we started releasing newer varieties like the Florida 80. So I came in 78, Florida 80 came out in 1982. So I've been with that program all the way through all these different variety releases that in part we helped develop up here at this research station. Long juvenile soybean, again, the breeders from other stations located elsewhere did a lot of variety development here at the station. So Kuhl Hinson was USDA, his soybean breeder located in Gainesville, and he developed a couple of varieties with us, and those were 2 forage soybean releases from our program here. I worked on Bahia grass, a couple of germplasms that we developed, and eventually UF Reata Bahia grass. And then lastly, perennial peanut. A lot of you see it growing in Tallahassee and other municipalities around the state. Others of you know it as a high-end hay producer. A lot of the varieties were developed or co-developed and released from University of Florida with some of the effort being done up here at this research station. And with that, this will end our little series, and we'll have a time for some discussion, but I want you to stay tuned for the next episode of our 100-year celebration when we discuss part 2, which will be the present.
Okay, so at this time, we don't have any, or let me check our chat real quick. We don't have any questions per se, but if anyone would like to go ahead and unmute and is more comfortable asking out loud or wants to share a story or anything, please feel free to do so.
I just wanted to say thank you to all of you who are helping to organize this 100-year event, and just a comment for Richard. When I was growing up in Alabama, the boll weevil eradication program reached us in the early 80s, mid 80s, and I remember all the sprays that it took to eradicate them. Can you comment maybe on how many sprays per season a farmer had to make? And what chemicals to actually eradicate the boll weevil in those fields, and how long it took in an area to do that?
Okay. The farmers didn't actually make the applications. The contracted applicators did through the USDA, and it could vary anywhere from 10 to 12, but it was over a wide area. That was what was really bad. A grower doing it himself would be mainly concentrating on controlling the boll weevil during the main part of the season. That one weakness that I mentioned about the boll weevil was that if you interrupted their feeding late in the season, prevented them from building up enough fat to get through the winter, they wouldn't make it through the winter. So late season applications were extremely important, and they were putting them on fairly regularly and over hundreds of acres in a fairly small area, rather than just a field here and there like a grower would do, and that still had some boll weevils to escape. So that is really what set off the beet armyworm problem. But it would not be uncommon in the first 2 years to have maybe 10 or 12 applications directed toward the boll weevil during the whole season, but most of those concentrated late season to prevent them from successfully overwintering.
Thank you, Richard.
Okay. If there aren't any other questions or comments, thank you all for attending. It is 1 o'clock, so I believe some of our speakers have other things they need to attend at this point. But I do want to remind you all that on September 9th, we will have the present, I believe, Dr. Matthews Parrott, Dr. Cheryl McCoviak, and Dr. Gary Knox will be our speakers at that time. So we invite you to join us for that one. And then again on September 29th, when we have our panelists who will speak about the future endeavors for the NFREC. So thank you all for joining us and have a good day.
Well, guess that went okay.